New Zealand sells itself as young, clean, and whole. Fjords carved by ice, sheep dotting green hills, a haka performed for cruise ship passengers before lunch, postcards from Queenstown, wine tours through central Otago, a ferry crossing at golden hour with the light doing exactly what the brochure promised. That is the version everyone buys, and it is not wrong, exactly. It is just not the whole country. Scattered across both islands are towns that once held thousands of people. Pubs, churches, schools, football clubs, brass bands, and today hold nothing but foundations under gorse and a locked gate at the end of a gravel road. Some died slowly, when the mine closed or the railway rerouted. Some died in a single afternoon, when the ground itself decided it had had enough. Nobody organised a farewell for most of them. The families simply packed the truck, and the bush came back in behind them, patient as it always is. Tonight I want to take you to 15 of these places, the towns New Zealand built with real ambition, and then, for one reason or another, quietly let go. Go on, subscribe, and I'll tell you the whole story. Number 15. Skippers in the mountains above Queenstown. Gold was found in the Shotover River in 1862, and within a couple of years, there were thousands of men working the canyon, cut off from the rest of Otago by a gorge so steep that the only way in was a road blasted directly into the cliff face by the miners themselves, inch by inch, with hand tools and dynamite. That road is still there, and it is still one of the most dangerous in the country. Most rental car companies void your insurance the moment you turn onto it. At its peak, Skippers had a school, a post office, a hospital, and a hotel, serving men who had walked in from claims scattered along 30 kilometres of river. The official story is straightforward. The gold ran out. The population left. The town died like 100 others. What the official story leaves out is how completely it happened. There is no slow fade you can point to in the records, just a scattering of dates on the school roll, thinner every year, until one year there is no roll at all. The cemetery is still up there, headstones facing a canyon that swallows sound. Whether anyone visits them anymore depends entirely on who still remembers the names. There is one detail worth sitting with: the road hand-cut into rock by men with picks and patience is the same road that eventually made the town obsolete. Once it was passable enough for motor vehicles, families no longer needed to live permanently on the claim. Men could drive in for a shift and home to Queenstown at night. The road built to connect skippers to the world ended up being the thing that let the world stop needing skippers at all. Keep that shape in mind, because you will see it again before we get to number 1. Number 14, Patea in South Taranaki. The Patea freezing works opened in 1883 and grew into one of the largest employers in the region, processing tens of thousands of sheep and cattle a year, and giving work to well over 1,000 people at its height, many of them from the local Ngati Ruanui and wider Taranaki iwi. In 1982, the company that owned it closed the works almost overnight, citing changing export markets and the economics of an aging plant. The town's population fell by close to half within a decade. Shops on the main street closed one after another. What the closure announcement did not mention, and what the official economic language never quite captures, is what happens to a town when its single largest employer disappears in one financial year. The most lasting response to that loss came not from any government report, but from music. The Patea Maori Club wrote and recorded a song about the closure that became a genuine hit, a piece of grief turned into something the whole country could sing along to without necessarily understanding what it was: mourning. The works buildings still stand, mostly empty, a monument to an industry that decided efficiency mattered more than the town built around it. Patea's unemployment rate in the years immediately after the closure was, by some contemporary accounts, among the highest in the country, and it fell hardest on the Maori workers who had made up a large share of the workforce and had few comparable jobs within reasonable travelling distance. Officials at the time framed the closure as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of a global meat market that no longer needed New Zealand's processing capacity in quite the same places. What that framing skipped over was the choice involved. Other works elsewhere stayed open. This one did not, and the people who lived around it had no vote in the decision that reshaped their town overnight. The song that came out of it is still played today, decades later, at gatherings that have nothing to do with the freezing works at all, which says something about how far grief can travel once it finds the right tune to carry it. Number 13, Bullendale, tucked into the Shotover Valley near Skippers. This tiny settlement holds a strange distinction. It was the site of the first hydroelectric power scheme in the Southern Hemisphere, built in 1885 to run the Stamper batteries crushing quartz ore for the local gold mines. For a brief period, Bullendale was, in its own small way, more technologically advanced than most of the country around it, lit by electricity, while nearby towns still burned candles. The gold seams thinned out within a couple of decades, and by the early 20th century the settlement was essentially empty. What remains today is foundations, rusted machinery, and the memory of an ambition that outran the resource base needed to sustain it. The official record calls it a footnote in New Zealand's engineering history. It might be more accurate to call it a warning about what happens when innovation arrives faster than the reason for it can hold. Think about what that timeline actually means. Bullendale had electric light before most towns in the country had reliable postal delivery, and within 2 generations the entire settlement was gone so completely that most Otago locals today have never heard the name. The mine companies that funded the scheme were chasing quartz reefs that, on paper, looked substantial enough to justify serious capital investment. The reefs simply were not as generous as the geology suggested. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a place that was, briefly, ahead of its time. No drama, no disaster, just a resource that ran thinner than the ambition built on top of it. Number 12, Tangarakau, deep in the King Country. This town did not exist to serve any local industry. It existed purely to build something else. In the 1920s and 1930s, construction crews working on the Stratford to Okahukura railway line needed somewhere to live in a valley with no other settlement for kilometres in any direction. So a town was built from scratch, over 1,000 people at its peak, a hospital, a school, a hall, a hotel, all purpose-built for men and their families with no permanence intended from the start. When the line was finished, the reason for the town's existence finished with it. Buildings were sold, dismantled and trucked out to other towns. What is left in the gorge today is mostly silence, a walking track, and a Department of Conservation campsite where the town hall once stood. Few places in this country demonstrate so clearly that a town is not really a place. It is a job, temporarily wearing the shape of a place. What makes Tangarakau worth pausing on is how deliberately temporary it always was. Even while thriving, families raised children knowing, in the back of their minds, that the school would close the day the last rail was laid. There was no pretense that Tangarakau was building toward permanence the way a farming or fishing town might. And yet for the decade or so it existed, it had all the ordinary texture of any small New Zealand community. Dances at the hall, a rugby team, a resident constable, arguments about the state of the roads. The valley does not advertise any of that now. Unless you already know the history, you would walk the track today and never guess that over 1,000 people once called this silence home. Number 11. Denniston, on the Coal Plateau above Westport. At its height in the early 1900s, Denniston held close to 1,500 people, at times more than Westport itself, living on a windswept tableland accessible only by the Denniston Incline, a nearly vertical rail line that dropped loaded coal wagons almost 500 metres down to the coast below. Children were born on the plateau, and, in some documented cases, did not come down to the flat ground until they were adults. The official histories treat Denniston as simply one more coal town among many. Its closure in 1967 a straightforward matter of exhausted, uneconomic seams. What that framing understates is the sheer physical isolation the community endured for generations. Fog for weeks at a time, supplies hauled up by cable, medical emergencies that depended entirely on the incline working. The ruins are a Department of Conservation historic site now, walkways built over the old foundations, standing up there on a grey day with the wind doing what it always did. It is not hard to understand why so many who grew up on that plateau never fully left it behind, even after they physically did. For a long stretch of Denniston's history, the incline was effectively the only reliable connection to the outside world. which meant that in bad weather, the plateau was functionally cut off. Doctors, when one was available at all, sometimes could not get up or down for days. Families weighed the economics of a mining wage against that risk and, mostly, decided the wage was worth it. That calculation, repeated household by household for the better part of a century, is a harder thing to reduce to a line in an economic report than exhausted, uneconomic seams. Number 10. Addison's Flat, inland from Charleston on the west coast. Few ghost towns in New Zealand have vanished as completely as this one. During the gold rush of the late 1860s, it held an estimated 1,500 people and, by some counts, over 30 hotels serving a population that lived hard and moved fast. Within a generation, the alluvial gold was worked out, and the town emptied just as quickly as it had filled. Today, there's no main street to walk down, no building frame to photograph. The bush has taken back every trace of timber and iron except one thing: the cemetery, headstones standing in undergrowth, names and ages of people who lived and died in a town that most New Zealanders have never heard of. It raises an obvious but uncomfortable question. If a town of 1,500 people can disappear so thoroughly that only its dead mark the spot, how many others have vanished without even that much left behind? The speed of it is what tends to surprise people who look into the records. Addison's Flat was not a decades-long fade like Skipper's or Denniston. Contemporary accounts describe a boom that peaked hard within a handful of years and then thinned out almost as fast as it had filled, following the same alluvial deposits that had drawn the rush there in the first place further along the coast, toward the next promising creek bed. The buildings were mostly canvas, timber, and corrugated iron, materials chosen for speed of construction rather than permanence, which goes a long way toward explaining why nothing survived once the population left and the West Coast rain got to work on whatever was abandoned. The cemetery endures for the same reason cemeteries generally do. Nobody thought to dismantle it and take it with them. Number 9. Pipiriki, on the banks of the Wanganui River. In the early 20th century, this was not a fading backwater. It was a genuine tourist destination, marketed internationally as the Rhine of New Zealand. Paddle steamers carried hundreds of visitors a week up the river to Pipiriki House, a grand hotel built to serve them, with verandas overlooking water that tourists compared favourably to the great rivers of Europe. The hotel burned down more than once, was rebuilt, and eventually the whole tourism model collapsed as roads replaced river travel, and the novelty of the paddle steamer wore off. What remains today is a small settlement, home mainly to the local Wanganui iwi, whose connection to the RWR long predates any tourist brochure and has long outlasted it. The official narrative calls this the decline of an early tourism venture. The community that stayed would likely tell you the river was never really for sale in the first place. It was only ever on loan to the visitors who came and eventually stopped coming. At the height of the river tourism boom, promotional material compared the Wanganui favourably to the Rhine, and the steamers themselves were fitted out with a level of comfort designed to make wealthy travellers feel they had found something exclusive rather than remote. Locals who worked the boats, guided the tours, and staffed Pipiriki House were, for a brief window, at the centre of the country's tourism economy rather than at its margins. The road that eventually replaced the river route was, in a sense, more convenient. It was also faster, more direct, and considerably less interested in the river itself as anything other than scenery glimpsed through a car window. Whether that counts as progress depends entirely on what you think a river is for. I'm curious whether anyone watching this has stood in a place like Pipiriki and felt that particular quiet, the kind that comes from a landscape that used to be busy and now genuinely is not. If you have, I would like to know. Leave it in the comments. Number 8. Bendigo in central Otago near Lake Dunstan. This one is built almost entirely from stone, and that is precisely why anything of it survives at all. Gold was found here in the 1860s, and a scattering of tiny settlements grew up around the diggings. Bendigo proper, along with the smaller camps of Logantown and Welshtown nearby, home to a few hundred miners working a landscape so dry that water for sluicing had to be brought in by race and channel across kilometres of hillside. When the gold thinned, so did the water investment required to keep chasing it, and the settlements emptied within a few decades. Because the miners built with schist rather than timber, the walls are still standing today. Roofless, doorless, but recognisably houses now inside a Department of Conservation Historic Reserve. Wood rots and disappears. Stone just waits. Bendigo is what is left when a town dies, but its skeleton refuses to. The water problem at Bendigo explains almost everything about the settlement's short life. Central Otago's gold was real, but extracting it at scale required sluicing, and sluicing required water in a district with some of the lowest rainfall in the country. Races and channels were dug across considerable distances to bring water down to the claims. An engineering effort nearly as significant as the mining itself, one that only made sense while returns justified the cost. Once the easiest gold was gone, the investment stopped paying for itself, and there was no second act waiting to take its place. Bendigo had one good run, and then it had a century and a half, so far, of empty stone rooms holding nothing but wind. Number 7. Puhipuhi. In inland Northland, this is a different kind of ghost town. Not gold, but mercury. In the 1890s, prospectors found cinnabar ore here, and a small mining operation grew up around the extraction of quicksilver, briefly promising enough that a real settlement took shape. The operation shut down within a couple of decades, judged unprofitable, and the settlement disappeared along with it. What the closure notices at the time did not mention, because nobody was measuring for it yet, is that mercury mining leaves the land altered in ways that do not simply wash away. Soil testing in more recent decades has found elevated mercury levels still present around the old workings, a chemical signature of an industry that came, extracted what it wanted, and left without cleaning up after itself. The area today is largely uninhabited forest. Whether that is coincidence or consequence is a question soil scientists are still working through, but it is hard not to notice that the land itself seems to have made its own decision about what kind of town it would allow to exist there again. Mercury mining in the 19th century was treated as an unremarkable industrial process, rather than the environmental hazard it is understood to be today. Cinnabar ore was heated to release quicksilver, releasing mercury vapor into the surrounding air and soil, and nobody involved understood what that exposure meant for the land long term. There is something quietly unsettling about a ghost town that emptied simply because the profit dried up first. And only decades later did anyone start asking what else had been left behind, buried in the dirt long after the last building had rotted away. Number 6. Ohura, in the King Country. If you want the single most photographed ghost town on the North Island, this is probably it. A wide main street lined with false-fronted shop fronts, verandas, an old picture theatre, almost all of it standing and almost all of it empty. Ohura grew around coal mining and served as a rural service town for surrounding farms, and for decades it also held a borstal and later a prison, which provided a steady core of employment even as the mines declined. The prison closed in the 1980s. The coal industry had already been fading for years before that, and the population collapsed from well over 1,000 at its height to a small fraction of that today. Local government reports describe the decline in the flat language of regional economic restructuring. What that phrase does not convey is the strange effect of walking down a main street built for a town of thousands and finding it standing almost entirely intact, like a stage set after the actors have gone home, and nobody thought to strike the set. But if that one unsettles you, wait until we get to number 2, because Ohura's kind of slow, visible decline is almost gentle compared to what happened on the west coast. For now, it is worth noting what made Ohura different from most of the mining towns on this list. It had 2 separate economic pillars, coal and the prison, and losing them both within a relatively short window meant there was no gradual cushioning the way a single industry town might occasionally get from a slower wind down. The buildings survived because nobody had the money or the motivation to demolish them. They simply stopped being useful, all at roughly the same time, and the town around them stopped along with them. Number 5. Old Cromwell, at the meeting point of the Clutha and Kawarau rivers in central Otago. This one was not abandoned by people walking away. It was drowned. Cromwell's original 19th century goldfields town with its narrow gold-era streets and stone commercial buildings, sat directly in the path of the Clyde Dam hydroelectric scheme. And when the dam was completed in the early 1990s, the resulting Lake Dunstan rose over much of the old town's site. Some historic buildings were dismantled and reconstructed on higher ground, as what is now called Old Cromwell Town, a heritage precinct built specifically to preserve a fragment of what would otherwise have vanished entirely underwater. Most of the original streets did not make that journey. They're simply down there still, under the lake, a genuine sunken town rather than a metaphorical one. The dam brought electricity to a large part of the South Island. The trade was a real town for a resource that a great many other people never had to give up anything to receive. The relocation effort was genuinely significant. Heritage teams spent years surveying which buildings could realistically be moved, and Old Cromwell Town today is a real attempt to keep a fragment of that goldfields character alive above the waterline. It is also, unavoidably, a reconstruction. The streets do not run where they used to run. Whether preserving a fragment of a town counts as saving it, or simply as keeping a souvenir of what the lake now covers, is the kind of question locals still debate over a beer in a pub built to resemble the ones that once stood somewhere out under the water. If you have made it this far, it would genuinely help the channel if you subscribed. Not because I need you to, but because it shows these kinds of stories are worth telling properly, and that they make sense to keep making. Number 4. Macetown, up the Arrow River Valley above Arrowtown. Gold was struck here in 1862, and within a few years the settlement had grown to something like 1,000 residents at its peak, with hotels, a school, a blacksmith and later a quartz-crushing battery when the easy alluvial gold ran thin and mining shifted to a hard rock. The town declined gradually rather than all at once, shrinking through the early 20th century until the last resident left sometime around the 1930s. What makes Macetown distinctive today is not just its ruins, restored stables, scattered stone foundations, but the fact that reaching it still means what it always meant: fording the Arrow River more than 24 times along a four-wheel drive track or walking the same crossings on foot. The land never made it easy to get to this place, and it has not changed that policy for anyone since, whether they came for gold or simply came to look. Macetown's slower decline sets it apart from the boom and bust pattern you see at Addison's Flat or Skippers. This was a town that adapted, from surface alluvial gold to hard rock quartz mining, investing in crushing machinery that required real capital and a longer-term commitment than a typical rush settlement would have bothered with. That adaptability bought Macetown decades that some of its neighbours never got. It did not in the end buy it permanence. The last hard rock reef eventually stopped paying. The population that had been shrinking gradually for years finally reached zero, and the valley went quiet in a way that felt less like a disaster and more like a long exhale. Number 3. Hyde, a small Otago rail settlement between Middlemarch and Ranfurly. Hyde had already been shrinking for years by 1943, its brief gold mining boom long over, its population reduced to a modest rural service community. On the 6th of June that year, an express train derailed on a curve just outside the town, in what remains one of the worst rail disasters in New Zealand history, killing 21 people. I will not dwell on the details of that afternoon. The weight of it belongs to the families who lost people there, not to speculation about the mechanics of the crash. What I will say is that Hyde's decline did not stop after 1943, and the disaster is now inseparable from how the town is remembered, whether that feels fair to the community or not. A memorial stands near the site today, and the old Hyde Hotel remains one of the few buildings still doing what it always did. Some towns fade because the industry leaves. This one carries an additional weight that never quite lifts. A wound the ordinary slow decline simply continued to close in around. The Otago Central Rail Trail now passes close to Hyde, and cyclists stop at the pub for a drink without necessarily knowing what happened on the curve just outside town. That is not a criticism of anyone. It is simply what happens to memory over 8 decades in a place with a shrinking population and no obligation to explain itself to every visitor who passes through. The memorial exists for those who want to find it. The rest of the town carries on quietly around it. the way small places generally do when they have already lost more than their share and have learned, out of necessity, how to keep going anyway. Number 2. Waiuta, on the west coast, built entirely around the Blackwater gold mine. From the early 1900s until 1951, Waiuta grew into a genuinely well-equipped company town for its isolation. Around 600 residents at its peak, with a hospital, a school, a cinema, and tennis courts, all serviced by a private company determined to keep its workforce content in a location with almost nothing else around it. In 1951, a section of the mine shaft collapsed, and the company that owned it determined the damage was uneconomic to repair. The decision to close was made quickly, and the town emptied almost as fast as the decision itself. Most buildings were sold off and physically removed within months, trucked out piece by piece to be used elsewhere. What is left today is a scattering of foundations, an old tennis court slowly being reclaimed by grass, and a walking track maintained by the Department of Conservation. Compare that to Ohura's slow bleed, or Skipper's generational fade, and Waiuta stands out for how orderly and how fast its ending actually was. A town given, in effect, a closing date. There is something almost dignified about how Waiuta ended. If a company town can ever really be said to end with dignity, nobody starved. Nobody was abandoned in the way some mining communities were, left with nothing when the money ran out. The company managed the closure the way it had managed everything else about the town, efficiently, with a plan, and with very little sentiment attached to the process. Residents were given time to arrange new housing and new jobs elsewhere, and most of them took it. What that efficiency cannot account for is the tennis court. It is still there today, cracked and grown over, a strange and oddly poignant detail in a landscape otherwise stripped back to foundations, proof that this was, for 50 years, an ordinary community with ordinary Saturday afternoons, right up until the moment it stopped being one. Number 1. Te Wairoa, on the shore of Lake Tarawera in the Bay of Plenty. Before 1886, this was not a struggling settlement at all. It was a thriving village built specifically to serve tourists on their way to see the pink and white terraces, natural silica formations so extraordinary that they were marketed internationally as one of the wonders of the natural world. Visitors from across the globe passed through Te Wairoa, a mixed Maori and European community, to be guided by canoe across the lake to the terraces. In the weeks before the eruption, some in the village reported unusual sightings on the lake, what was described at the time as a phantom war canoe, witnessed by a group that included both Maori and European tourists. A respected tohunga, Tuhoto Ariki, is said to have connected the sighting to a coming disaster. At the time, most dismissed it. On the 10th of June 1886, Mount Tarawera erupted with almost no warning, burying Te Wairoa under ash and mud, killing well over 100 people, most of them Maori, and destroying the pink and white terraces themselves, a natural wonder erased from the surface of the earth in a single night. Excavated foundations of the village are open to visitors today, treated as the historic and, for many, sacred site it is. Of everywhere on this list, Te Wairoa is the clearest example of how completely this country can lose something: a village, a family, an entire natural wonder the rest of the world had only just discovered, in the space of one night, after a warning that almost nobody took seriously until it was already too late. There has been renewed debate in recent years among researchers about whether fragments of the pink and white terraces survived beneath the ash and the lake, buried rather than obliterated outright, a possibility that would once have seemed like wishful thinking and is now taken seriously enough to justify ongoing investigation. Whether that turns out to be true or not, it does not change what happened to Te Wairoa itself. The village that guided the world to one of its natural wonders was, itself, treated by history the same way the terraces were. Assumed gone, mourned briefly, and then folded into the general story of a disaster, rather than remembered as the community it had been the week before. What survives now is respectful, carefully managed, and quiet in a way that feels appropriate for a place where so many people lost their lives. It remains, in every sense that matters, hallowed ground, and it is treated as such by everyone who cares for it today. 15 towns spread across both islands, and almost none of them share a single cause of death. Gold ran out, coal ran out, a freezing works closed its books, a mine shaft gave way underground, a dam filled a valley with water on purpose, a mountain erupted without asking permission. What they do share is something quieter. Every one of them was, at some point, somebody's whole world, and every one of them stopped being that without the rest of the country pausing to notice. New Zealand does not really mourn its lost towns the way it mourns other things. It photographs them, occasionally, and files them under heritage, and moves on to the next headline. Maybe that is simply what happens to a young country still deciding what parts of its own story are worth keeping. Or maybe it is worth remembering that every thriving town on the map today is, in its own way, one closed mine, one bad decade, or one large enough decision made somewhere else entirely, away from joining this list. None of the 15 places we have covered tonight failed, not in any meaningful sense of that word. In every case, the world around them changed faster than the towns themselves could, and New Zealand, being a young country, still building its own sense of what it wants to remember, did what young countries tend to do. It looked forward. That is not necessarily a criticism. It is simply worth pausing on every so often before the next town quietly joins the list. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.